Welcome to the Artsy Raven, a show about writing, publishing, and the arts. With your host, the award-winning writer, editor, and publisher, J.F. Gerard.
Welcome to another episode of the Artsy Raven. Today our special guest is Natalie Southworth. So Natalie's short stories have appeared in literary journals in Canada, the US, and the UK. They have won the Brighton Prize, placed third in the Moth Short Story Prize, and were finalists for the Fish Prize, the New Quarterly's Peter Hinchcliffe Award, and Prairie Fire's McNally Robinson Booksellers Short Fiction Contest. Originally from England, she lives in Montreal with her husband and children. Her debut short story collection, There's Always More to Say, was published by Linda Leith Publishing in March of this year, 2026. So welcome, Natalie.
Thank you for having me.
So can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. So yes, as you mentioned, I'm from England originally, but moved as a girl. Moved around a lot growing up. So from London to Toronto to Vancouver, a little bit at Halifax, and then I ended up settling as a grown-up in Montreal, where I live now. Yes.
Oh, you've been to more of Canada than I have been. I haven't been to Halifax. So yeah.
Yeah, I did move around a lot. I mean, I've seen this country, I'll say that, which is great. Yeah.
Now, what inspired you to become a writer?
I think reading. I know that might sound trite, but or common as a response, but I was a big reader as a kid and as a teen. And I remember actually reading a book by Daphne du Maurier named Jamaica Inn when I was about 13. And I ended up writing a sequel to it when it was about 10 pages long and terrible. But I wanted to know, what happened next and how she did it. So my curiosity was sort of sparked through reading. And I ended up probably not having enough courage to go straight into it. I think it's, how do you do this? How do you make a living? How do you have a life and write? So I think my fallback was by going into journalism. So I became a journalist initially.
Okay.
And I, while working as a journalist, which I did like, I was questioning it though, all from the very beginning. I thought, is this really for me? Because there was so much I couldn't write about. So much I saw all the time that was sort of entering into me, and I couldn't do anything with it. And I wanted to process it. And in journalism and daily news, which is what I was in, it was a constant hit of daily information and intense information that felt to me like I wanted to explore in ways you couldn't. So I ended up as a journalist. I was working for the Globe and Mail in Toronto, and I remember seeking out all kinds of other writing. I was reading creative nonfiction and gonzo journalism and then increasingly short fiction, because I was curious about what else could satisfy this itch that journalism was not satisfying.
Okay. So then you discovered short fiction, and then, I mean, what drew you to short fiction versus novels?
I think some of it was a practical reality when I started writing, which was, quite late on in terms of I had kids, and I know other writers have talked about how short fiction is this manageable form because you don't have to map out entire lives and stick with something for 3 years. You can begin writing and publishing without that time frame, so you can do it quite or more quickly. So there was that attraction, but also that I just was reading more and more fiction that was shorter, and I found it, I guess it's that emotional force of the story, and you're being taken in as a reader into usually a very powerful moment. That's what stories tend to be built around, but they're quiet moments. And because so much is left unsaid in stories, which is what to me the best stories have a lot left unsaid, you're almost engaging at a level that is a bit different than with a novel. And that just really interested me as a reader. And then I wanted to understand how these writers I was reading, how they were doing this. So I would say that.
Okay. Now you've won like a lot of awards. Like, has that recognition influenced your writing career?
It helped. It's definitely helped initially. A couple of the awards I won early on, and those helped with further publishing and publication of other stories. Absolutely. It opened a door for sure. I would also say when I was starting out, I sent stories to contests. And I found it was almost easier I don't understand this, to be shortlisted or win a literary prize that was fairly a good one than get published in a prestigious journal.
Yeah.
It
Okay.
was, I don't know why that is. Maybe it's the slush pile and getting in
Yeah.
and all that, where with the contest, you have to be read. They have to read you because you've submitted it to the contest. But I also have found, and the reason why I was drawn to contests, especially in Europe, in the UK, was their word count lengths are long. Whereas
Oh, yeah.
many literary journals, especially increasingly in Canada, are smaller and smaller. And my stories tend not to be super short, or, so I had a hard time. Where can I submit to? So the contest became a kind of helpful resource as well.
Okay. Now, you were a journalist first and then you became a writer. Did you develop any habits along the way to help you on your writing journey?
That's a good question. I think starting out as a journalist was very helpful in one way, and that is writing to deadline. So I'm pretty disciplined where I can use, so I work full time now. I work for myself. I do communications consulting for environmental groups, and that's full time. And I've always done that, and I have kids. So how to fit in the writing is not sort of an obvious, easy way to go about writing stories. Again, the stories in a shorter form help, but um, I became fairly good at carving out time and using it and knowing I've got to make use of this time. And so with time, though, I've now figured out that I try and keep Fridays to write. So over time, that evolved to, it's much nicer having a longer stretch of period to be able to really, engage and enter into. So over time, I've been able to sort of carve out a longer stretch on Fridays, and if opportunities come where I'm not working so much, I'll use those times. So time is something that's improved, but I think just that discipline from meeting deadlines. So I create deadlines for myself in the creative writing as much as I used to do in the nonfiction.
Okay. Now, let's talk a little bit about your book that's out. There's always more to say. What was the
Yeah.
original inspiration behind this book, and do you want to give us a little synopsis?
Sure. Well, I never sat down to, just like I never sat down and said, I want to be a writer. I never sat down and said, I want to write a book. I was writing stories. Um, Increasingly out of necessity, I needed to write stories. It was kind of a way to process a lot and to help in sort of counter this sort of the crazy world we live in. It was necessary, that art and that expression. And then when I had enough stories that had been published that I thought were strong enough, I thought, okay, maybe I'll think about a book now. So that's how it came to be. Just initially, just lots of stories. And then it was about finding the stories or choosing and selecting stories that could actually work together in a collection. Because I have a lot of other stories that aren't in the collection. And so I chose the strongest, but that were also thematically linked. And most of them have to do with this idea of, or they have to do with characters who sort of lose themselves as they chase what they're supposed to want. And so they're hyper individualistic. That the world of the stories is hyper individualistic. They're urban stories. They're set in cities across Canada. They mostly involve families, family dilemmas, but there's this core that they have around this distance we get from who we are in our chasing of what we're supposed to want.
Now, why did you want to write about that?
I didn't set out to. It just is what kept coming up.
Yeah.
Um, I think I should say, as I wrote into those themes, one became particularly, and this was pointed out by, others, not myself. So this is why I find writing's almost easier than knowing what you're writing, like being able to explain what I'm writing. I never sort of think like that. So I see that there was a real thread, which was, psychological fragility, or in the world we call, mental illness. That kept coming in. And I think it very much was this, you know, core symptom or more like an effect of this hyper individualism and this kind of intense consumer capitalism and the effects it has on people. And there were just so many stories, and there still are so many stories, because these issues affects all of us, whether it's in family members or friends. There's and there's not a lot of language at the ready that isn't diagnostic or limited in some way to really capture the human experience of feeling left behind in those ways. And so I found myself more and more delving into that as that was uncovered, as I uncovered it. But I never set out to.
Mhm. Okay. Now, without giving out too much spoilers, was there one story that was particularly challenging to write that sort of you remember the most?
Yeah, I would say there are two. One is called Period of Transition, which is about a working mom who is trying to get off or wean off her antidepressants that she's on. And why that was a hard one to write for me was because it's the kind of the most intimate story in terms of voice. Like it's third person but direct, so it's very close to that character. So I found myself having to really be in her head through the story, and I had to do that justice. And so I did a fair bit of research for it, but I was so close to that character, it was emotionally taxing at some points. In terms of more of a technical challenge that has stayed with me, is a story named Shiny, which is about a dog, really. But so much happens in that story. There are so many ties that sort of need to come together in a very short space, very compressed space, that I found the structure of that story, the technical components, quite challenging.
Now, what do you hope the readers feel after finishing the collection of stories?
Well, mostly I just hope they feel.
Okay.
That's that, and maybe, to be moved in some way, or awakened to something, even, curious about other people's lives. Any of those things would be brilliant.
Okay. Now, for people that are starting to write short fiction, what makes a good short fiction story to you?
Oh goodness. There are a lot of components. Most good short fiction, well, it doesn't explain. It leaves a lot unsaid. They tend to revolve around a moment, have a tremendous emotional wallop, even if the moment is a quiet moment. Um, they don't explain, analyze. There's this wonderful kind of impression that's left.
Okay. Now, where do your story ideas usually come from?
Often, I mean, I'll have an idea for something, and it'll be a kind of perhaps strange, absurd idea that I don't know what to do with. And it stays inside of me for a while. And then often I'll get a voice, like a character or an image. And if I see that image through, maybe it's moving to me in some way, or maybe it's funny. And if I take it further along, I see where it takes me and it goes. And that's usually how a story will start, often with an image, but it could be a compelling voice.
Okay. Now, what's the best writing advice you've ever received?
Oh my goodness. I would say, I don't know who told me this, but go where the energy is. So
Hmm.
when you write, we can spend so long drifting around, and the thing to do is really, as soon as you touch on something that could be a piece of dialogue, it could be you've come upon some strange image that you don't know where it came from. Follow it, go with it, take it where it needs to go, and don't stop it and interrupt that by, for example, going back in your story or to try and work out the proper spelling of a name that you're mentioning in the story. Don't worry about that stuff. That's all can be taken care of. It's where that heat is to go with that.
Okay. Now you're going to do a reading for us. Can you give us a little bit of context and then you can start reading?
Yeah, so I think I'm going to read an excerpt from one of the stories. It's the last story in the book. It's called Inheritance. It's one of 3 interconnected stories in the book that involve the same family. And it's sort of over the course of about 40 years. And in this story, 2 sisters named Cora and Rachel, they're now middle-aged. And so in the beginning of the book, they were young. They're now middle-aged, and they travel to collect their estranged mother's ashes after she died. And they themselves, they live in different countries and aren't close. At the funeral home, no one came out from one of the hallway doors to greet us. Rachel and I didn't speak about our mother, our theories about her life, our remaining mystifications. As we sat in the 2 facing armchairs, Rachel began to talk about her time working as a cub reporter. She talked about a funeral home she covered that had misidentified the dead, that a cremation lasts about 4 hours and takes place in a chamber called a retort. Funny name, she said, although she didn't smile. You know, it's not unusual for the casket lining to burn with the bones. I didn't need to know the gory details, what Rachel called life, and I closed my ears and imagined her voice merging with the sound of the air conditioning. A young woman appeared in the hall and waved us over. The floors were thin, and the creaky plumbing groaned through the walls, and the flute followed us into the small room. On a table in the corner was a document I had to sign to claim the ashes, and my mother's death certificate. On another table was a display of urns. Rachel picked up the remembrance bar that could hold a pinch of ash. There was an antique book-style urn for $800 and a sand urn that floated in water. As I signed the document, I thought the process was cheap. The forced silence, the weeks-old carnations, the woman who was far too young to be asking us if we needed a moment to reflect. Will you be burying an urn in a special place for your mother? She whispered, barely a whisper, the top button of her pale pink polo shirt buttoned as if in a last-minute attempt at formality. We were so quiet in that room with only the flute and the pipes through the walls. Rachel didn't answer. I thought perhaps now that we were there in person and it was becoming more concrete that our mother had left the world, Rachel was in shock, or she was searching for a story idea. For me, I wanted only to have the ashes in my hands. I said we'd like the cardboard box option and soon, not sure the young woman would understand that there was to be no viewing, no service, no memorial. I didn't even have an address for my mother's apartment, just P.O. Box 162, where I could reach her if needed, a silver box in a mall. She moved apartments frequently and didn't always forward her address, although she never moved far from the Oceanside Park. Once when I was 23, I'd followed her through the park. I'd flown out to Victoria on a whim. When I spotted her by chance on the sidewalk near the park entrance, I didn't know what to do, so I started walking behind from a distance. I suppose I was searching for understanding. I'd read and reread her emails, listened to the music that she'd praised. I remembered her slanted handwriting with the long tails from when she wrote my first initial and last name on my school binder labels. Grade 1, 2, 3, 4. Not 5, not 6. For grade 7, she started up again for one last year. All the memories of her combined into something like a shivering leaf, unable to settle, to be holdable by the eye. That day in the park, she walked with a limp, stepping each foot as if below might give way. She was 52, my age now, and was spectacularly routine in her appearance. She wore a tucked-in collared shirt with a wool v-neck, dark denim jeans that appeared pressed, and a beige sun hat with 2 laminated cutout paper eyes stuck to the top, presumably to scare off the crows. The big blue eyes facing the sun might have been the only giveaway. Otherwise, she was a harmless-looking person, indispensable to no one, cupping her hand across her forehead to peer up at a circling eagle and the herons in their nests, alive to a constant threat of attack. I watched what she watched, smelled the same warm rain, and stopped and started when she did, as if we were playing a private game. I didn't call out to her. I didn't know if my mother was receptive or close to an edge, if interrupting her chosen solitude would break a kind of pact. I stayed back, but I must have been looking for direction in her steps. She ran her hands under a fountain. She ate a plum she took from her pocket. She followed a route through the park and repeated it. To survive, as it was if she was meticulously regulated her life. She went without. As the years passed, I began to think that such a willing limitation amounted to a kind of grace. There was something honorable in not being someone craving to be seen. Of course, I didn't know the details of her life, the extent of her suffering, if she'd managed to quell her troubles. There was so much I didn't know. I filled in the gaps myself. Even in the flesh, she wasn't real. She was an invention, a kind of imaginary being, which I suppose meant that she could be anything. She could provide all the answers. Do you have words for an engraving? The young woman asked. How to explain that our mother's life was like shards of data without a pattern? If I tried to summarize my mother's life, it would sound more like me. What is it that you don't understand? I said. The poor girl blushed a deep red. Rachel looked up, and I suppose she might have put my impatience down to grief, as I did her slow exploration of each urn, her eager interest in the brochure, her purchase of a scattering tube. The young woman left to find out if the ashes had been packaged, which they had. They arrived in a white, waxy box that she placed in my hands. As we returned to the parking lot, Rachel said she wanted to look at the columbarium. I waited in the car, the box growing heavy on my lap. It was a strange sensation, as my mother had been an ambiguously alive person, more like a living ghost. And now that she was dead, I didn't know what had changed. I suppose I thought the ashes, with their heavy presence, would show me.
Wow. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us here at the Artsy Raven.
Well, thanks so much for asking me and inviting me. It was a great Thank you.
The Artsy Raven is produced by Dark Helix Press. Introduction voiceover by Chris Gorman. Music by Tim Moore. Please access your bonus content on the Patreon website. Thank you very much for listening, and please